Welcome to the Podcast Expansion Network, your go-to destination for insider tips and success stories in podcast growth. I'm your host, Victor Dwyer, and today we're joined by Bill Yount, founder and co-host of Catching Up to FI, a podcast dedicated to those who are late starters on the journey of financial independence. Bill, thank you so much for joining today. Please tell the audience a little bit about you and your podcast that you're running right now.
I'm Bill Yount from Catching Up to FI, and I'm an emergency physician. I'm 59 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I realized about age 50 that I didn't have any financial literacy. I didn't know what a net worth statement was. I didn't know how much we'd saved. We were living paycheck to paycheck. And I realized that I was not the only one in this situation. Actually, we argue that the average American is in this situation of being a late starter to the journey to financial. We live in a consumption society that preys on us, and we do not live in a saving mindset society. We live in a spending mindset society. My partner and I, Becky Heptig at the time, tried an experiment, and I needed something else to do with my time outside of emergency medicine from which I was burning out. I needed a creative outlet. So we started a podcast thinking, we'll do 10 episodes and we'll see how it goes. Probably nobody will listen and it will die a quiet death.
That's awesome. And so what happened after that, after your 10 episodes?
We realized after one or two that we were committed to a daily podcast. So we're a daily show. We're an interview-based show. We have two hosts. I'm the founder, and Becky Heptig was my initial co-host. Currently, we're a year and a half in, and at about the year mark, Becky exited to live her best life in retirement. And I brought a new co-host on, Jackie Cummins-Koski, who's a CFP and has some real credibility in the space and is also an author and a speaker. So it invigorated the show at a time where I was wondering if it was going to survive, if it was going to go on with just me. And I couldn't see that happening because our demographic is the Gen Xer. We call ourselves the silent generation of late starters, the lost generation. And I needed a female on the team because 75%, at least on a straw poll, 75% of our audience is females in the 40, 50, 60-year-old age range. Jackie kindly came on and we've been growing ever since. We started at zero. We were literally at ground zero. But the best part is we had a network base. Becky and I had spent a few years in the space. We'd gotten to meet a lot of the players in the space, in the podcast arena, in the financial literacy and independence arena. So we had contacts and supporters. I had started a Facebook group called Financial Literacy Project, just as a place to brain dump all the things that I was talking about, learning about, reading about for others. And that grew to about 2,500, but it was all a one-way street. I was dumping all the information out there. There was really no engagement or self-generating content. But it was a place to start meeting people. And it was a platform upon which I flexed my muscles with Facebook Lives. I used to be a DJ back in the day in high school. It's fun. Yeah, well, I'm 59 years old, and in high school back then in 1983, we still queued up the vinyl. And it was a very different arena, and podcasting was a natural transition back to my roots. So at any rate, the story of the show, which I think you're interested in, is starting from ground zero. We had our first show that was maybe 30 listeners, but we rapidly were on other shows. We had built very rapidly a Facebook group of Catching Up to FI that was rapidly growing. Currently, we're at 15,000 members. And that was part of our growth, was bouncing off of the Facebook community and other communities that were in the same space, and then having shout outs everywhere organically, and then being on a lot of other shows. So we saw going from 36 downloads for maybe our first show, we're now seeing 6,000 downloads in the first week of a new show. We've had 700,000 downloads to our show. We have about 40,000 downloads a month. And the only regret I have is that we didn't necessarily monetize sooner, because it became such a big endeavor that I had to hire work out. I bootstrapped the first 40 episodes. I was the producer, editor, organizer, and co-host.
And janitor.
Yeah. And there was a lot of sweat equity involved there for sure. But I'm very type A particular, and I was scared to take the leap. I was scared to do something. I had been a podcast consumer for years, and I could not imagine that I would have a graphic up on Apple Podcasts that was my home, and a home that people would come listen to. A lot of podcasts, 90% of them fail. in the first 10 episodes or something like that. You could give me the exact numbers, but I think I've heard that. And I think in creating our base and creating our community and creating our network before we launched, we hit the ground running.
That's amazing. And you're actually the first person on here that's ever, I believe, that co-host things. So can you go into why your decision versus co-hosting versus doing it yourself? I know you touched on it a little bit, but can you go into why do a co-host on the podcast and not do it maybe just a single host?
Less pressure on one person, certainly. I think you can grow better as a team. And I certainly do not have all the creative ideas in our team. We actually have a social media coordinator now. We had a show notes writer, and our social media coordinator is volunteer. This is not a money making operation for us. We are now covering costs because we hire out a virtual assistant monthly in the Philippines that does a great job for us. And I should mention that it only costs $10 an hour for us to get our video, shorts, and audio all edited and produced. So I would encourage people that want to be more creative and less involved in the business of producing a show to potentially outsource that as they grow. But as far as to answer your question with the co-host scenario, like I said before, our demographics were men and women, and it turned out more women than men, because they often get a late start through divorce or financial trauma, and they are the ones that reach out for help, maybe more than the man. Takes their head out of the sand, overcomes their shame and regret in being financially illiterate, and will reach out. In order to speak to that audience, it's only natural that I would have a woman, and I'm really lucky to have a woman. That's only 10% of the certified financial planners in the financial advising space are female. And I've got one of them on my show. She happens to be Black. She happens to be a single mom. She happens to be a late starter. She hits a lot of the buttons that really resonate with our community. Heck, I'm a white guy who's a higher income.
I couldn't tell, sorry.
Yeah, who's a higher income professional that doesn't necessarily speak to the person that's earning under six figures and wants to know how to become financially independent. I don't necessarily speak to the person that's earning low six figures. And how do I do it on my income? And Jackie, my co-host, did it on an income less than six figures throughout her entire career. And she retired, having started at 58, she retired at 49, a multimillionaire.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, so that's why, and she has a different perspective. She obviously brings some math to the arena. I'm more of the emotion, and finance is math and emotion. She helps organize the show. She has a network of her own, as do I. We collaborate, bring in guests, and we're able to reach very preeminent guests in our field. That's one of the attractions of our show. It's not necessarily the caliber of the guest, meaning their luminance. It's the story that you tell, but it really helps to have big players in the space, because people want to say, hey, it helps with your marketing. They're somebody. They got this person on the show. They got this person on the show. My goodness, I've got to listen.
If you don't mind me asking, how do you handle the ownership of the show? Meaning that I could see that bringing someone else on, they would be like, hey, like I could see this conversation. Hey, Victor, I see this show is doing really successful. Like, how do I get a cut or things like that? And it's maybe you don't have to discuss your particular scenario, but maybe you can discuss a scenario of, hey, we cut the profits by 40%, or we like, how do you arrange that co-hosting side in your, I don't even know what the word is, like deal? I think I don't even know. How do you arrange that co-hosting collaboration? I
Well,
guess is my question.
there's no written contract at this point. It's a discussion in progress. And my first co-host, she contributed to the startup to get the website and the show going. She contributed $1,500. I'm transparent with numbers. I contributed around $7,000 between website and startup costs. And that's probably more than it needed to be, really. It doesn't cost much to start a podcast, but I wanted to have a really glitzy website. So the designers don't come cheap, and I didn't do it myself. I wanted to have a strong foundation on which to build, as opposed to a half-assed do-it-yourself website. So yeah, there was capital costs involved there, and then there's maintenance costs. And our maintenance costs for the show range from $4,000 to $5,000 a year. At $10 an hour, it's about $250 an episode. We do an hour of content, and he edits the audio, video, and shorts. But in the end, with all the subscriptions that you got to have, in our case, we use Descript and Squadcast like you do. We host with Libsyn. There's those costs. And then there's a couple other, there's the hosting and domain name costs. So there's ongoing costs that are in the background, and all told, it's roughly $4,000 to $5,000 a year. At this point in time, we started monetizing we solicited our own ads, our own host read ads. We reached out to advertisers, created a campaign. We created a media kit with bronze, gold, and platinum packages that people could buy. And to be honest, it's a lot of work. It really is. And this is not my full-time job. This was an expensive hobby that was inhibiting my path to FI. It's to the tune of $4,000 to $5,000 a year. And I got to the point where I'm like, I got to cover costs. And it doesn't make sense. People expect podcasts to be free, but they have no idea what kind of work goes into them, all the research. I'm reading a book for an episode, and then it's hours and hours of work. It's a passion project for sure, and I love doing it. And people love to consume our content. So we're very happy with that. Heck, I've gotten more gratitude from our audience of thank you, you've changed my life. Thank you for what you're doing than I've gotten in 26 years of practicing emergency medicine. This is a one-to-many approach. I'm talking to 6,000 people every week. That's just on one episode. 40,000 people a month are listening to our shows. So there's a certain responsibility that goes with that. But there's a cost to it. There's a time cost to me and a financial cost to me. So at this point, we're covering costs. We just flipped the easy button switch with Libsyn to throw in their programmatic ads, 2 pre-roll, 2 post-roll. And that should add up to about $400 or $500 a month when run in the background, which will cover the cost of the show. And we'll still be able to solicit our own host-read ads at much more lucrative 100% return premiums, and we'll throw those into the mid-roll. Or we may throw in a programmatic mid-roll and add in a couple of mid-rolls because of our show from our own advertising packages. It gives us a lot more flexibility, I think, and I wish I'd have turned this on early on. We may see a reduction in listenership because people get annoyed by these ads, but what the audience has to realize is the host has to compensate themselves at least for the cost of the show. And only the top 5% of shows are going to make serious money. Let's be real. You've got to have, say, 100,000 downloads a month. Apple changed their algorithm, which caused a significant drop in downloads and listenership, as I think a lot of our industry knows. And here I can talk about being in the industry. I can talk about being a creator. I never thought this would be the case. It's become a little small business hobby now. And I'm proud of that. We're watching it grow, and we'll see where it goes. As far as what are we going to do with the partnership, I own the business. I'm going to buy out my previous co-host and pay her back her CapEx. And then my current co-host is financially independent. She doesn't need the money. But as we get to, and our social media maven does it because it's a passion in her life. She believes in our mission, and she just booted herself up, taught herself how to do it, and have at it. Social media is a bottomless pit. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, please do. And she does a great job. But at a certain point, it would be nice to provide them with a couple $1,000s to say, go on a vacation. So it's play money. It's not my life's blood. And I'm willing to learn, however, though, as long as it doesn't impact the control over our content and the message we want to get out there, that we'll continue to grow this way. And I hope the listeners understand that this is a necessary part of podcasting.
Yeah. I want to touch on the growth because it sounded like you guys grow pretty fast. So what did that involve? I know you said you touched on the Facebook growing and people shouting you out a little bit, but can you go into a little bit on how you grew the podcast a little bit?
What is important to do when you're starting your own podcast is niche down. You want to compete with yourself and not with thousands of others in the space. What's your niche? You got to ask yourself. And our niche is the late starter to financial independence. We call ourselves a mindset, money, and life show for late starters of any age on the road to financial independence. We all wake up and go, shit, what did I not do? And how do I catch up? That's why we're called Catching Up to FI. Heck, I bounced the name off my wife, off my co-host. It took us a while to come up with that. And then I hired a graphic designer to come up with a graphic. You got to put your brand out there from the start. What your foundation is what you have to build on. And it's really important to pause and think about these things. And as far as growing the show, we've had a lot of organic growth, a lot of word of mouth. It's unbelievable. They find our Facebook community, they find the podcast, friends, and that's why we're on the show here with you today. We want to reach a community that doesn't know about financial literacy, that doesn't know about financial independence, like I was when I had my head in the sand and just my hands over my ears and didn't know what I was doing. And we want to buy back our time. All of us want to be financially free, and we're in a space that nobody else serves. If you search this, literally, there are one or two shows that ran a few years back, but there is no show that's focused on this avatar of the Gen Xer, male, female, that lost track of their money, wakes up and wants to figure out how to catch up. So it's a natural fit for me. It's a natural fit for my co-host. And it resonates, if you think about it, with a large swath of not only the US, but the world population. We have listeners all around the world, in the English-speaking world. We have listeners in Australia. We have listeners in Great Britain. We have listeners in Canada, because these concepts that we're talking about, the stories that we're telling, are universal. And it's really critical to niche down and then craft what's the story you're trying to tell. And we bring on experts on our show that talk about facts and metrics, and this is what you do. We bring on first-time podcast guests that have a story to tell. And sometimes those episodes resonate even more with our audience. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It's great. And I wanted to ask about, how do I phrase this? I wanted to ask about how you basically, if someone came in right now and they were brand new to podcasting, okay, they haven't started a podcast, they're thinking about it right now, what would be the process you would give them to starting a podcast? From what it sounded like your process was that you were in stuck in that kind of hole of trying to, like, late to being financially independent is what I heard. And then you're saying, oh wow, there's no podcast out there, so you're stuck in that same scenario, and say, hey, there's no podcast out there, I'm going to talk about this, is what I took from that. Would you recommend other people starting a podcast doing the same thing, saying, hey, I'm like, for example, I love the Dallas Cowboys, and then saying, okay, I want to start a Dallas Cowboy podcast, I don't see one out there yet, I want to start that. What would you change about that? How would you change that up?
You can get all excited about doing this. And I was in analysis paralysis for years. My son was after me, Dad, I'm tired of hearing you talk to me about finances. Go find someplace else to talk about it. And that's how the Financial Literacy Project Facebook group came into being. But then he was on me for a year or two about starting a show. And I had imposter syndrome. I thought, hey, what do I have to offer? And analysis paralysis. I thought about it, just like anything, just like with finances, before I acted. And some people will say, jump in and learn as you go. I would say that's part of it. That's definitely part of it. So you can get off your ass and get started, but you've got to think first. I have a little moniker called pause, plan, and pivot. So you have something that makes you uniquely your own. You have something in your head or a passion that you have that is a unique niche where other people are going to live as well. So you got to try and blend those two together. What's your passion and what's a niche that you serve? Because it's not about serving yourself. And I think a lot of people get into podcasting, just have a monologue about what they're interested in and then hope that people will be interested in it as well. And that doesn't work that way. And that's a way I think for podcasts to fail. You got to think about who your avatar is. Who is the person, the avatar that I am speaking to and that speaks to me? Because a podcast in many ways should be a conversation. Yes, you're listening to it. It may be a one-way conversation, but they're going to reach out to you through the Facebook community, through emails, through your e-list, through all the other ways that you can disseminate information in this low startup cost, internet-based media empire that you're going to create ultimately out of your show if you want. So once you've done those things, you got to get through the tech stuff, and that's pretty simple. Just we chose Libsyn because it was to host our show, which will dictate some of the things that you're going to do and learn. And they have a lot of online courses that you can take to do that. I chose Audacity, a free podcast editor, to use. I took a $70 online course to learn all the bells and whistles so that I can learn to edit my own shows. And I would encourage people to do that before they outsource so that you know the language of what you want your ultimate show to be. And then we ran it through Phonic to clean up the sound, which is another free resource. What else did we need? We needed a website, and people say that they want to host it with Wix and make their own. We went through WordPress, and I host it with my web designer. So there's that. And then for your editor, Squadcast, and I'll give them a shout out. You use them, we use them. They have some glitches just like everybody does, and there's some limitations, but overall we've been happy with it. Don't split hairs and decide which one's better for this or that. If you have the interest to live stream your shows to YouTube, then there are platforms that will do that. Squadcast does not do that. If you're into doing YouTubes, for example, and we do post all of our video to YouTube because that is the way podcasting is going. So you've got to think about video in your audio podcast on the front end so that it doesn't become something, and we didn't, it became something we added in later. And we use for our editing there, we use Descript, which is, I think Descript owns Squadcast. So they're seamless in transition. So that's our formula for sort of the tech of how to. And then after that, I suggest that people record, I would say if it's a weekly show, record a minimum of 4 shows. Have a month in the can. So but we didn't do that. We recorded a show and I edited it and dropped it the same week. And that becomes stressful, especially when you realize that your audience, we realize really quickly, our audience is expecting another show at 6 a.m. on Sunday because the audience grew very quickly to hundreds and thousands over the course of the first few months, which a lot of shows have a hard time doing. They have a hard time getting over those first 100 listeners, and that seems to be a mile mark where they get excited. We didn't have that problem because we were over our first 1,000 very quickly, so we were very fortunate. But I think we had laid a lot of the groundwork, and a lot of that was community-based before we launched, and it was after that, it was a done deal. And as far as growth goes, we've reached a little bit of a plateau. This is like in the hockey stick thing. You've just got to keep going. You've got to keep plugging away. You got to produce every week so that people expect you to be there. You can't just do it ad hoc. Then people will listen to one and they're gone. If they know they can count on you like the Sunday morning newspaper, and that's what our approach is, they're going to count on you and they're going to be waiting for that next one. You want them waiting to hear what you're going to give them. And being consistent is the only way you're going to do that. There's probably a lot more to say there, but I'm holding a monologue. I want to turn it back to you, see if you have any more questions.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And it sounds like since you built the community beforehand, that's what made it where the podcast grew extremely fast after that. It sounds like you learned the strategies, growing a community there, and then you were able to send that traffic to the podcast is like really just how you grew that podcast. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and then word of mouth after that. And then getting your message out there. We were on a lot of big shows. Our contacts were at the top end of the industry. Chartable is going away, and that's one way we knew how we were doing. The chartable.com rankings, and we're in the investing and business podcast arena. And we've broached the top 50 in both investing and business. And we've been consistently in the top 100. Business, the top 200, investing, the top 100. And we've beaten out a lot of shows that I had listened to. I could never imagine this, that I had listened to in all my consumption days. Chartable's going away, so I don't know where to get the metrics anymore. But seeing your graphic in the top 50 of investing podcasts up against the Afford Anything, the Choose FI, the Stacking Benjamins, All the Hacks, the Dave Ramsey Show, which is always number 1. I'm in the top 50 with him there too. It's really, I couldn't let it go to my head because I had no idea how to measure things. I didn't know before that if we were doing well or not. We're not in the rarefied atmosphere of the ones on Spotify, iHeart, that are making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. We're having fun and we're providing a service.
That's awesome. Before we finish, what would be your one actionable takeaway for someone trying to start a podcast? After everything they listen to, what would be your one actionable takeaway for someone starting a podcast?
There may be, you'll have to give me 2. The first one is get over yourself, get over your imposter syndrome, because the emotions are a big barrier to starting. and you've got to overcome that. And the big takeaway at how to get started is just realize that you have something to say to an audience that wants to hear what you have to say and engage in the dialogue. Build a community and niche down to your avatar of who you're talking to, your audience. And you'll be amazed how many squirrel lovers you find out there if that's your thing. It's amazing. But if you try and go too broad, you're going to get diluted. You've really got to hone your message down.
That's amazing. Bill, thank you for your time today. Please tell the audience how to find you, find more about the podcast. Please tell them all that information.
I want to help you out. People can reach out to me personally, and I'll be happy to jump on a call with anybody, because it does take that ground level encouragement and know-how, the work you're doing here, to help people get started. But I'm at www.catchinguptofy.com. You can email me at bill@catchinguptofy.com. We have a website. The show is called Catching Up to Fi. We're on all the socials at Catching Up to Fi. But reach out to me personally. I have a lot of fun with this. I want you to have fun with it. And we've got lots of shows out there, but you have your voice and you have something to say. Get started, but do your homework.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you for the audience that listened if you did get this far. And this is the Podcast Expansion Network, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks a lot.